Hello, folks. Welcome to the Marshawn Brooks Show. Bit of a delay in the anticipated release schedule. No excuses. Gotta be better about that. Showing up to engage with the practice, regardless of what happens. Maybe not even despite what happens, but incorporating life events into that authentic self-expression. That's the way that I'm going to reach success in any area of my life. Consistency. Regardless. Because, up to and including, whatever might occur. I'm not sure if that made sense at all, but we're going to roll with it. So, kind of because of something that Jay said to me a week or so back, I have been thinking about the concept of blessings in disguise. I know I've had a heck of a time since last we spoke, since last I recorded one of these, and I've had some time to think, consider, meditate upon various topics, this being one of them. Now, it's not breaking any new ground to suggest that things that might on the surface seem deleterious can, in the medium to long term, be beneficial. Or that the reverse could be true. That things which might seem like blessings, like boons, can lead to our demise in the long run. To give an example of each, I heard I think it was a Zen proverb once, a little story about a farmer who one day found a pack of horses, his wild horses, roaming through his land. And, horses, especially in that time of place, were capable of tremendously greater amounts of work than a human being. And here he just finds them, roaming around the countryside, no owner, no nothing. So he takes them in, puts a bridle and a set of reins on them, and they start doing work around his farm. Now somebody says to him, what a great boon this is for you. How lucky you must be. He turns to them and says, we'll see. Now, year passes, year and a half, and his son is riding one of those horses, galloping through the countryside, having a great time. The horse hits a rock, bucks him out of the saddle. He falls down and breaks his leg, wails in tremendous agony, clutches at his leg. And of course, at that time, they didn't have modern medicine, so this meant that he was likely going to be, if not crippled, then at least damaged for the rest of his life. His family gathered and cried, mourned for him, though he was not dead. When his wife turns to him and says, "How could this happen to our son? What a terrible, terrible thing this is." He turns to her and says, "We'll see." A year after that, his son's leg is healed, but he still has a limp. He's not the athletic specimen that he once was. The king has been waging a war, starts marshaling troops to battle, calling every able-bodied man who's fit to fight. They come to recruit to his farm, finds nothing there but an old man and a young man with a gimp, with a limp, with a disability that never fully left him. Neither one of them is deemed fit for combat. The army goes on to have a crushing defeat. Everyone in what would have been their unit dies. His broken leg had saved him. Again, his wife turns to him and says, "Oh, how lucky we are." He turns to her and says, "We'll see." The point, I guess, being there that we can never really know the ultimate consequences of our actions or the ultimate consequences of life's events on us. We are too unaware of the full breadth of cause and effect as it ripples outward or inward. And so instead of assigning good and bad, positive and negative valences to things, perhaps it's more useful to think of these things, more skillful to think of these things in terms of their utility and how we can best operate with realities as they are in the present moment. And you can think of the opposite as being true as well. People who win the lottery jump for joy as all their problems in life are now solved. Well, what does the research and the history tell us happens to those people? Nothing good. They end up drug addicted, penniless, and alone. As something that was supposed to be a blessing ripped everything from them. So I've been thinking about blessings in disguise, about instead of judging things based on how comfortable they might be, or how good they might seem to be, or bad they might seem to be in the short term, thinking about how can I use this? What can I do now? Jocko's concept of good. So I had a week from hell. I heard Dan John once say, some guys burn the candle at both ends and then have a blowtorch in the middle. And I was doing that. I was down to sleeping an hour and a half a night, trying to do well in my studies, my workplace, personal development projects, athletic development projects, develop this into something. And it was all just stacking on top of me. I had to get it done, gotta get it done. And I'm in the middle of phase 1 of Live Hard. So of course those power list items have to get checked off, no matter what. There's just so much to do, not enough time, or maybe just not enough time management. And my work schedule had gotten real hectic, constantly getting shuffled around, so there's no rhythm. And I was reaching a breaking point. And I had several nervous breakdowns in the course of a week's span. Still, I had to keep my nose to the grindstone, get myself back together, and hammer through. That was the mentality. I started really feeling fatigued. My cardio just wasn't there. Didn't feel myself. I just chalked it all up to being under the weather, changes in weather patterns. Of course, not sleeping at all. And it became clear that things just weren't improving. Turns out I got COVID. So we can examine here why that's a good thing. Obviously, that precludes me from, as I work a physical job, precludes me from being there. Not fun being under quarantine. Not fun being ill, especially as somebody who's not used to being in that position. But my mind turned to thinking, what might this provide me? Instead of thinking about what is it taking away. And it gives me time to focus on the projects outside of my day-to-day work grind. Things that I actually feel are important. More time to focus on those things that, without having that blowtorch in the middle. Gives me time to rest, reset, recalibrate, dial in my sleep, catch up on it. It gives me immunity. So it's not, that particular disease isn't something I have to worry about, at least for the next few months. I was facing a potential layoff or potential furlough, given the way things are in the job market right now, and it was an excuse to use some sick days so I could still get compensated as hours are starting to dry up. And most importantly, it's a way that I can recalibrate and hit the ground running when all of this is done. Oftentimes, the boon and the benefit is right there if we're willing to look. Pause, step back, remove ourselves from the negatives that we see up front, and look for them. And this positive framing can get really annoying. I really dislike it when something happens in my life that nobody would ever ask for, want, few would accept. And it's just, one after another of these things happens. All stacked on top of each other. And somebody tries to tell me, well, look at the bright side. Like, you wouldn't want to live this life. You would never choose to go through this. So don't tell me to look at the bright side. There is no light, and there's no other side of the coin. There's no silver lining here. So with that being said, as much as my inclination is sometimes to be irritated by those attempts at positivity, by trying to force a more lighthearted narrative onto a rather grim situation, there are practical purposes for it. So much of what we get out of life is down to how much we are willing to pay attention. The ability to see, focus on what's important, and have a perspective that can lead us where we want to go. That can separate us from our neighbor down the street, even if we live in very similar environments, have very similar, economic surroundings. One person knows what to pay attention to, and how to navigate the hierarchies, the booby traps, the pitfalls, the opportunities that come across them. Those two people can end up in very, very different places. I had a book of Aesop's fables when I was a kid. And when I was really little, the drawings kind of scared me. But I did get a lot of value from the stories. And I think that human beings, absorb lessons from story and narrative more readily by far than they do so by textbooks and these dry academic tomes. And I think there's a reason why fairy tales and fables and proverbs that are written in that format, parables, have survived and stood up against the test of time and continue to be taught to children and continue to be guiding lights in the lives of adults to this day. And so Aesop, his stories came from watching and paying attention. He was not a guy who grew up or lived in a time with advanced technology or complicated scientific advancements. I mean, sure, the Greeks were advanced for their time, but nothing by today's standards. But he paid attention. He looked and was able to extract principles, meta-truths from the patterns of behavior that he saw from people around him, from material realities that he saw, even between different members of the animal kingdom. He was able to look past the obvious and immediate facts, the atoms that he was seeing, and look at the ideas they could represent. There's not much in his stories that's really that fantastical aside from talking animals and talking inanimate objects. But even those represent a sort of truth that's almost realer than real. We think about the story of the scorpion and the frog. The scorpion asks the frog to ferry him across the river because he can't swim. And the frog says, how do I know you're not going to sting me? Well, the scorpion says, well, if I did that, then both of us would die. Frog says, fair enough. Makes sense. I mean, it's logical. Mutually assured destruction. We all know that is always a guarantee for peace. So he takes him on his back, hops in the water, and is swimming across. As they're almost to the other side of the river, the scorpion raises his tail and sticks it into the frog. The frog turns around to him and says, you've doomed us both. Why would you do that? The scorpion says, it's in my nature. Now, obviously, a scorpion, I would think, never spoke to a frog or never spoke at all. The idea there that we can examine that interaction between two animals and take away from it a lesson that is powerful enough to last past dozens of empires, to watch regimes, millennia, rise and fall, and still stick with us. I think that tells us that there's something there. There's value there in being able to look beyond the obvious and penetrate the ostensible. So I'd say that the value of positivity and that sort of reframing isn't, this Tony Robbins, yay rah rah, everything is awesome all the time. I wake up with a big smile on my face. I certainly don't. The value of positivity is the value of paying attention. Learning to make lemonade out of lemons instead of molehills into mountains. And I do believe that is a skill. There's so many things that we think of as innate talents or inborn traits are skills. And a lot of them are influenced by, big five traits that people might be predisposed to. But there are practices involved, and I think that people just often develop them kind of by accident as children without a real rigorous system behind it. But they develop them as skills just unintentionally. Just because that's the most common way that people come across them doesn't mean that it's the only way. I mean, let's face it, most people don't have any skills at all. Eric Weinstein once said that most people have never had an idea. Coming up with something original is difficult, and it's uncomfortable, and it's a path littered with failure after failure. It's a long, hard road. And with that kind of barrier to entry, of course, most people aren't going to pay the cost and stay the course. As Seth Godin said, attitudes are skills. They are things that we practice and develop and hone. And they're tools that we carry with us through life and constantly have to learn to apply. That positivity, if you even want to call it that, maybe I could come up with another more suitable name. Optimistic utilitarianism. Maybe that's a better one. I'll have to consider that. But it allows us to extract lessons and develop tools from what we see and experience instead of just being an unthinking passenger throughout life. You can live, I should say maybe you can survive, because those aren't necessarily the same thing. Two people can be alive for 65 years and not only be very different people by the end of it, but have had radically different experiences, radically different lives in that span of time. If I have an interaction with somebody at the supermarket, maybe I spend a little time thinking about the implications of that interaction, what it means as far as my social skills, what I can learn from that if I examine it with purpose. I can allow it to change me and make me a better person. Or I can just not think about it at all, go about my day, and forget it ever happened. That choice is mine. And that's a skill that I develop and continue to develop. Getting out of life what we put into it. That those results in the knowledge that we acquire, or perhaps I should say the wisdom we acquire, being somewhat dependent on the amount of cognitive legwork that we're willing to do. That's fundamentally, at least what I see, when I look at the landscape of positive reframing, and then some like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT techniques. That's why I think they're truly useful. Not just because they make you feel better, although there is benefit to that. But how can I be more effective? And then I have something to feel better about. Because just feeling good. If you feel good about nothing, or have nothing to feel good about, maybe you can trick yourself for a short time if it's based on nothing. But I think for most people, that's not really going to work. That self-esteem and a positive self-valuation has to be rooted in something solid. So I think the way forward is really having actual skills, having made actual contribution. And Rogan says, be the hero of your own story. Behaving on a consistent daily basis, even when you don't want to, especially when you don't want to. Like the person that you know you should be. Like a person that you would admire. And then you get self-esteem. And then you get to feel good. And then it's rooted in something solid. Often what holds us back in life is something good. And when something that we see as bad happens to us, it's very easy to fall apart and shake our fist at the sky, tear our garments, and shave our heads with the shards of a clay pot. Little Job action. But in order to really put ourselves together, I think a prerequisite is often that we fall apart in the first place. Many people, myself included, as those of you who listen to episode 000 will know, the end of a very valued relationship is something that prompted one of the things, major factors that prompted my current journey of personal growth. And if you had asked me then, I would not have chosen to give that up. But it was what was holding me back. It lulled me into a zone of comfort, the easy path that leads downhill. And I was sliding. I was letting myself get out of shape, become intellectually lazy, become softer as a person, become somebody that neither myself nor she could admire. And that good thing that I was too blind to see the detriment of was slowly choking the life out of my potential. When we think about a job, and we tell ourselves, I like what I do. It pays good money. I like the benefits. I like that I get to help people. Even though we know every time we go to put our key in the ignition on Monday morning, every time that alarm goes off and we know I have to go back to that office, you're not really excited about it. You're not truly happy to be there. Even if it's not terrible, is it really an authentic expression of your full potential? For most of us, I'd say no. I know for what I'm doing right now, the answer is a resounding no. But it's something that I've been able to tell myself stories about. Some of which are true, some of which could be fabrications. I've been able to tell myself, hey, I'm helping people. Hey, I'm growing a skill set. Hey, the world's crazy right now. Job market isn't what it was. Now's not the time to look. And having that security, having that safe zone where I think everything's going to be okay, that'll lull you to sleep. And that'll hold you back. And we often forget that a rebirth requires a death to begin with. As the great philosopher Ronnie Coleman once said, everybody want to be a bodybuilder. Don't nobody want to lift no heavy ass weight. The combustion is a precursor to the phoenix rising from the ashes, right? The first step of that transformation that we view as glorious and something beautiful to behold is that burning in the first place. The burning off of the dead wood, as Jordan Peterson would say. Separation of wheat from chaff. And when we find out that most of us is chaff, that's a painful realization to have. And it's an even more painful process to undergo with intention. Saying to myself, I'm going to remove the dead and useless parts of me, even though that represents most of who I am, so that I can regrow anew into something more powerful in the end. The phrase necessity is the mother of invention is one of those sayings, another one of those sayings that has become kind of a cliche because people just bandy it about without really thinking deeply of the meaning. If you reverse that, invention is the child of necessity. We might never invent anything if we didn't need to. If we didn't have an imposed demand upon us. It's life or death. It's do or die. And if this new thing, this new form, does not get brought into existence, then we get taken out of it. That's why wartime is what leads to the most absurd quantum leaps in technology. Because the stakes are as high as they get. And there's no option that we have other than to rise to the occasion. And in an environment like that, with that unforgiving set of selection pressures, we have to have the best come out of us. And I think few would argue that war is a pleasant experience. But necessity is the mother of invention. And birth is a messy process. We come into this world kicking and screaming, as do our ideas. As do all the things that we create. Nothing comes without cost. There is no beauty without sadness. We do not pass the other side without paying a toll. And we talk about the value of positivity. There is great value in negativity if we learn to see it. It is often pain that convinces us to move in the first place. Many old-time strongmen. I was really into Eugene Sandow, George Hackenschmidt, Otto Arco, those guys. I really looked up to those guys when I was younger. I was a wrestler in high school. And so seeing what guys, whether they be ancient Greek or Persian, Indian or Iranian wrestlers, how those guys were trained, or how guys, when catch wrestling was in its heyday, how those guys with connections to the circus and to acrobatics and tumbling, the physical culture. I always liked the idea of a unified theory of human movement. And a lot of those guys were born frail and sickly and weak, had some sort of club foot deformities, and were underweight and bird-chested. And it was that very thing that got them into physical development in the first place. And they ended up being some of the strongest men to ever live, performing feats that most people can never dream of. But they never would have undergone that training or paid that toll, had that cost extracted from them, if they had not been forced to by circumstance. If they had been gifted, say, with even above average levels of strength from birthright, they never would have developed or felt the need to develop absurd levels of strength. So it was weakness that gave birth to power, darkness that gave birth to light. And guys with world-class game were driven to study it for a reason. You have naturals, quote-unquote. I don't really believe in that concept of a natural, but that's a concept for another day. Guys who were just, you find some sort of success in that area of their life. They don't feel the need to research all sorts of theory and undergo this really painful learning curve of the pickup process. There's no need. They find themselves in a social circle that supplies them with enough They don't feel drive or desire to go for it all. To move from where we are, we first have to be convinced that such a task is necessary. In jiu-jitsu, for guys who train, it's no secret that the most technical guys are the ones who had to develop technique. If you just go into the gym and the only mount escape that you ever had to perform as a white belt is just thrashing around, and you were big and strong, so it worked on other white belts. You keep going, you get your blue belt, and all of a sudden, people know the defense to that. It doesn't work anymore. So you started with an advantage, or what you thought was an advantage. Smaller guy in the corner said, let's wait and see, because he had heard that Zen story. And all of a sudden, you're behind. Your technique has been hampered by what seemed to be a good thing to begin with. There was no selection pressure on you to develop the technique. And so you never needed to. And so you never did. Those are hard principles to put into practice. I'm really convinced that most of us know, at least to some extent. We don't know all of it. You can't know all of it until you really walk the path. And those do so for years and years and years consistently. But you know enough to get started. And the rest you discover along the way. Whether it's how to improve your financial status, your career position, your physique. You don't know everything. But you know some things, and some things are all you need to get started. To take that first step. You know what your most ideal self would look like, at least in part. And when push comes to shove, a lot of these principles, even though I'm not saying anything new here, you've probably heard them before, but a lot of that we just revert into habit when demand is placed upon us. And these philosophies go right out the door. They stay in the realm of intention and thought. And I meant to, as opposed to action and deed and I did. I think a lot about why. What separates I mean to from I did? Why do we allow that separation to occur? Do we not want to be our best selves? Do we not want to improve? To evolve, to grow, learn and change? I think it's clear that what stands between our higher self and our lower self, between the king and the pauper, the hero and the coward, is the cost of what we say we want. And a lot of times we say we want something, but the way that we act speaks to a different truth. I might say I want to win more than anything. But when time is ticking down on the clock and I'm gassed out and I feel like I have nothing left and I have the choice between letting off on the gas pedal for those last few seconds and pushing even harder. And I choose the former. I've chosen comfort over victory when push came to shove. When the alarm clock goes off in the morning and I have a workout scheduled and I choose to stay in bed, I've chosen sleep over fitness, even though I might pay lip service to the notion of valuing the latter. Again, we all know fundamentally, at least partially, what to do. And some of how to do it. I could ask anybody how to live a richer, more meaningful life, how to forge themselves into an improved version of who they are. I ask any man on the street that question. They'll give me a list. They'll tell me diet, eat more good food and less bad food, exercise, elevate your heart rate, pick some heavy stuff up, read good books, be on Instagram less, do something creative and artistic, something generative, maybe a little less consumption, spend more time with loved ones, less time with people that are negative, smile more, frown less, laugh more, watch less news and TV, take a more active role in developing your career, yourself, your family life, all those facets of you. Spend less than you earn, save and invest, take some time to travel and see the world. There's nothing complicated there. Anyone could give you that. Everyone knows that. And there are niceties within each of those. I say eat less good food, eat less bad food and more good food. Well, what's good and what's bad? How much should I have of each? Those are entire fields unto themselves. But we don't need to know everything in the field. We only need to know enough. And the way that you know enough is by caring to. And even though we all know those things, how many of us do them on a consistent basis? How many of us do any one of those things on a consistent basis? Let alone all of those things. Day in, day out, without fail. Like Jocko said, the easy path leads downhill. And if we stop moving, and we stop trying, and we just go into default, we'll start rolling the way that gravity takes us, feeling the pull of the influences we surrounded ourselves with, of the norm, of the average, of the median, of the middle, that point that's as close to the top as it is to the bottom. Maybe we avoid striving, struggling and straining towards who we know we can be because it's difficult. But people, in some ways, are really resilient. Sometimes I'll see some really, not just fat person, but I mean somebody that just looks so unhealthy and devoid of vitality that I look at them and my heart breaks to think of what agony they must be in. And that person is soldiering on, living life day after day. They're already working hard just to get up the stairs, get out of the car, get into the store, that takes a physical toll to live that way. So I don't know that it's necessarily the difficulty or greater or determination. Maybe, maybe, it's because we don't want to have tried and failed. In Pride and Prejudice, I think there was this character who said, they're talking about somebody playing the piano, and she said, if I should have ever learnt, I would have been a great proficient. Now, I could do that too if I just tried. We like to lean on unrealized potential, tell ourselves stories about how we could do that if we put the time in, if we had a trainer, if we had the time, the opportunity, the inclination, the desire. I could. I didn't, I haven't, and I won't. But if I felt like it, I could. That line of reasoning helps shield the ego and protect it from the poverty of what we're willing to act out in the world. But putting yourself on the line and failing, and anything that is worth doing will bring failure again and again and again and again. You will be tapped out, knocked out, put down over and over again. And you keep getting back up if you want to get to where you want to go. Or you can tell yourself stories about how you can do it tomorrow, you can do it later, you could do it if you wanted to. And you can feel good about that and pat yourself on the back. I had a friend talking to me once about some difficulties they were going through in life at the moment. They felt that things just weren't happening for them. Their sister was the shining star in the family, had a great high-paying job lined up, was going into this degree program, really prestigious, and they are just kind of stuck in this dead-end position, kind of not seeing a way out, grinding their way through school with nothing to show for it. And they told me, I wish I could just know, if I could look into the future and see if everything worked out as a result of me doing this. And so I think the real fear that we have, the thing that talks us out of putting our best foot forward or putting our foot forward at all, is not wanting to have tried in vain. Given our effort, our sweat, our blood, and our tears, and to have it be for nothing. But we got to realize, folks, that we're all in, no matter what. We try to save ourselves and save our effort for only when we're sure it's going to all work out in the end. But this game of life is 100% fatal, and nobody makes it out alive, and it gets all of us. It is filled with misery and tragedy, chaos and destruction. We will see those we hate glide past us on the way to the top. We will see those we love suffer despite And sometimes because of our best intentions, we will lose those close to us. We will make mistakes that we cannot take back. We cannot decide if we suffer. That's the first noble truth, right? Existence is suffering. But we can decide what we suffer for, what we sacrifice in the name of. Our effort cannot be saved, it can only be expended. Spend it on what you know to be worthwhile. Sometimes it gets to me. It gets to me a lot. I've spent years toiling, working hard, grinding, and suffering, and I feel I have very little to show for it, if anything at all. And I've seen other people, less intelligent, less tough, less hardworking, you name it, glide on their way to the top. Seemingly without effort, cheating on exams, showing up late, not paying attention, never getting comeuppance, seemingly being rewarded for a lack of effort, a lack of knowledge and skill and dedication. But mommy and daddy had a trust fund, so it doesn't really matter. So I fall into that comparison trap too. Remember, everything I say, I'm speaking partially to myself, because I am the worst offender. And so the other day, it was really all getting to me. And so I started reading some Epictetus. The Stoics. It's not complete. Not a complete philosophy. But I think there's a reason why it's such a popular one. Because it's very, very useful. Especially when times get hard. And Epictetus was a Greek slave turned philosopher. And what I love about him is that he taught philosophy not as a theory, a set of just ideas and notions, but as a practice, something that you lived, didn't just speak about. I don't want to say he wrote, but he has this book called the Enchiridion. It's I guess the Greek translation is like handbook. It's basically the Stoic manual. Very, very short, brief read. It's a collection of his teachings that his student jotted down. And it kind of meant as a field guide for daily life. So in this field guide, Epictetus has a kind of a story, an example of how you conduct yourself at a banquet. I fall into that comparison trap, as I said. I look at other people and think, why don't I have that? Why does this guy get this? Why does that girl get this? Why are things so hard for me in particular? All the time. And what I think their life is, at least, because of course I, in reality, don't actually know. It's filled with sunshine, roses, and cupcakes. I want strength. I want respect. I want mastery. So he has this story about you look at other people. You look at another man receiving honors and you're upset that they don't go to you. Or you look at an Olympic athlete and you think, oh man, wouldn't I love to be in that position? On the field with everybody's jaw on the floor, marveling at my ability. Well, he gives this example of being at the market. And, at the market, the way it works is you give some money. He uses the example of an obulus, which I guess is part of a piece of their currency. The name drachma, that's what it was. A piece of a drachma. I guess an equivalent, and a more modern equivalent would be a piece of 8, and then more modern equivalent would be like a cent, or a few cents, or a few dollars. You get lettuce. You give money to the cashier, they give you lettuce. If you don't give money, that cashier doesn't give you lettuce, and you understand why. You don't go home feeling slighted or injured or abused or taken advantage of. You don't ask yourself, why me? How come that guy's walking out with 3 bags of lettuce and I have nothing? You understand that you didn't give what needed to be given in order to get what you said you wanted. Well, some things cost money. Others cost early mornings, anonymity, ridicule, and toil. And if it's worth it, it's worth it. If it's worth it, then we will give that cost. And if it's not, then we won't be upset if we don't receive it to begin with. Dan Gable once said, if it's worth doing, do it every day. If it's not, don't do it at all. Another one of those principles that makes life real simple when you stop to think about it. So why do we avoid paying that cost? What are we saving up our effort for, if not for what we know to be a worthy cause? Maybe it's because we don't want to have tried in vain. Maybe it's something else. I'm really not sure. But what I do know is what it's like to live with unfulfilled expectation, unfulfilled desire, and unmet needs as a result of an inability or unwillingness to simply go after it and spend so much time swirling brandy by the fireplace, pontificating about theory and hypothesis, and not being the man in the arena, learning along the path. Epictetus says that, when you see someone with a life that you think you want, receiving an honor or an acclaim or a thing that you think you want, pause for a minute and look at what comes before and look at what comes after. You look at that Olympic athlete, don't just see them on stage. Look what they did to get there. strict diet, intense exercise, abstinence from indulgence, early mornings, early nights, living a completely regimented existence. And then look at what comes after. That you'll bloody your nose and break your bones, pop joints out of the socket, and you still might not win. You probably won't win. And then ask yourself, do you really want it, or do you just kind of want it? You talked about necessity earlier, being the mother of invention. And there's a saying that really resonated with me once, that nothing great was ever made on unlimited time and resources. And many times constraint and boundaries and limitations are what give us the impetus and the ability to be creative. Because if we don't ever need to be creative, we won't be. Or if we don't ever give ourselves the demand for outside the box thinking, then we'll just stay in our cozy little corner. Now you can think of examples from TV and cinema where the director didn't have a costly piece of equipment, didn't have a great budget, didn't have access to all sorts of technological marvels, and not only compensated for that, but because they didn't have those things, managed to produce something incredible. You know, The Mandalorian, that first season, famously didn't have that big a budget. The original Star Wars movies, you know, that A New Hope, OG Star Wars, they did a lot of things very creatively because they didn't have all the technology and the money that we have now to produce this blockbuster hit. And a lot of the movies come out now just feel soulless. These $100 million, $500 million projects. And I wonder where the money goes. How many AAA production comedies with top of the line effects and really expensive budgets have you seen that are actually funny? How many of those really last with cultural impact? Victor Hugo, when he had the contract for Hunchback of Notre Dame, was famous for not wanting to write. And it got to a certain point where the deadline was approaching, and the publisher said, you know, like, we're gonna take back the advance if you don't get to work. Guy loved to party, loved to socialize. That's what he wanted to do besides write. Because writing's hard, of course. So he was up against it, up against the deadline, very little time to work, and very serious consequences if he didn't. An advance for an author is an absolute lifeline. So he buckled down. He gave his friend all his clothes and fancy possessions and left himself only like this ragged shawl, like this robe that wasn't suitable for going out. And so he couldn't socialize, he couldn't entertain. All he could do was sit inside and write. He put those confines around himself, and in doing so, was able to produce something he had been putting off for months in a relatively short period of time because of his limitations, because of his constraints, because of the pressures that were placed upon him. Many of the great discoveries and inventions in science have come from overpromising and over-delivering against the clock at the final hour. Greatness comes from a need, not from a want. True metamorphosis comes from that demand, not from merely an idly wishing. I'm back here in the closet, still not convinced that this is ever going to go anywhere, that anybody is ever going to listen, or care, for that matter, let alone get any value from what I'm doing here. I don't have fancy equipment. I don't have the technical know-how. I don't have a production team or any connections. I don't even have friends that are willing to be on the show. Sit down for an hour and just talk. So it doesn't seem to me like I'm ever gonna be able to turn this into anything. Even as a solo runner of the show, I obviously don't have any know-how in terms of organizing this whole thing or putting my thoughts in a coherent package or making it entertaining and having logos and intro music and this, that, and the third. But maybe I can turn that constraint, that set of boundaries and limitations, into something magical. If I just keep showing up and engaging with the process. As I work on it, I must have faith that it will work on me. I think that's enough for today. Hopefully that was somewhat intelligible. Thanks for tuning in.